Hey everybody, and thank you for tuning in to a brand new episode of 11D Life. We're happy to have you with us this week. We're having an absolutely amazing time this week, an amazingly rad time this weekend. Holed up in a cabin in the woods of North Carolina, bringing you our experiences and conversation. As many of you know, a huge part of this podcast is being a creator and talking about the music that you create. And one of the reasons that we started the podcast in the first place was to start re-engaging the Eleventyseven fan base, because we were about halfway through making an album. What was this, last November?
Yeah, it was last November.
We had started demoing. So
you guys have been working on this a long time.
Yeah. So for everybody who's tuning in, who is an Eleventyseven fan, this is our 5th full-length studio album. It is our first one in 6-7 years?
Yeah,
since Sugar Fist. Yeah, Sugar Fist came out in 2011. Yeah. So, but yeah, this is kind of the thing that brought us together. I think it kind of put us all back in the same room
this
together.
Is what the people want to know about.
Yeah. So the name of the brand new record.
Ooh,
in case you
coming
don't
out next month.
Coming out next month.
So at this point,
we're going to debut the name of the brand new record.
Yeah.
You guys
right
still
now,
calling it Selena Gomez?
We're still
right?
Yeah,
it's called Just Do It.
Nike. It was some kind of it's Let's Do It Nike Swish.
Let's do it swoosh.
Swish.
Okay. So Davey.
Yeah, so I think at this point they
Selena
would probably
Gomez.
already know the name of the record.
Yeah.
Unless they or just
Oh,
now
okay,
listening to
yeah.
this. But in case you didn't know, the name of the record is Rad Science.
Yeah.
And
if they don't know, you can bleep that part out.
So I actually have a hard time remembering how we actually came up with the name for the record.
so I think that originally
There were some really bad ones.
Yeah, so
Science
it was
is rad.
November of 2016 when we started working on it.
Yeah.
Right?
We had started demoing and had about 3 or 4 demos.
So
in the works.
the summer before that, we were at the beach together, you and I, and we said, "Hey, let's do it.
Let's just do the record.
Let's make a record.
Yeah.
Let's do the Eleventyseven rebirth thing we've been talking about on and off for years."
Yeah.
And we were wading in the water, contemplating life, and you said, "We're just going to name it Bad Kitty." And it's just, and it's going to be a cat in a leather jacket or
I
something
wanted to
stupid
call
like
the
that.
record Bad Kitty. I don't care.
And I said, "You know what? I'm really excited about this journey we're going to embark on. I'm not gonna,
but not with that.
I'm not really going to mention that I really just hate that a lot." So
You said you were being honest with me, Davey. You said you were going to tell me the truth always.
Bad Kitty.
I did. So yeah, Bad
Can't
Kitty.
even imagine that cover.
Pretty cool name.
Yeah. So
Well, we thought maybe we could have a super old Polaroid of a cat attacking a small child or something.
well, we actually have a super old Polaroid of
Selah.
my wife as
Yeah.
a 3-year-old, and she's using a cat in place of her face. She's holding up a cat to hide herself.
Yeah.
And we thought that was a pretty cool picture.
Yeah.
And that's really the impetus for the whole thing.
Maybe Bad Kitty comes after Rad Science.
Yeah,
We'll see.
maybe.
But then we batted back and forth. We were like, well, how about this? And I think one of us said Bad Science. And then we were like, Then one of us said Rad Science. And we're like, okay.
I'm pretty sure it was you that said Rad Science.
I was trying to be
Get it,
humble.
Davey.
But
Yeah.
it was totally me.
But I think the idea behind all of that made sense to me, because it's the 11D creative process is so experimental. It is so much holing yourself up in a studio for weeks or for weekends or for entire nights on end, where you're just trying things out. You're trying sounds out. You're plugging synthesizers into distortion pedals or running guitars through synthesizer filters or programming drum beats and seeing what happens, or just trying out 100 different vocal melody lines over stuff. And so that was our creative process, but also within the emotional dimension of what we were experiencing with the band, we're also kind of experiencing or experimenting with being back together again, and kind of easing our way back into that. We started hanging out a lot more. We started having deeper conversations.
Yeah, and we actually
I had worked on your record.
Yeah.
Before that.
And that was prior to that, we really didn't hang out much.
Yeah.
The band ended. There was a couple of years of not a lot of contact, text back and forth. And then we
a couple cookouts here and there.
Ended up doing an EP, decided from that to start a label, and then from that to say, okay, well, it's logical now. We're all in the same room. Let's just do an 11-7 record. And it's really sort of the idea you get the right ingredients in the room and then something happens.
Right, and that's science. And that's why when I heard the record and I was hearing these demos over the last year and a half, and I had heard that before I had heard the name of the record. But when I heard the name of the record, it made sense to me just because it pulls all of these different elements together. Like you said, experimenting, getting you guys in a room, writing together again, all of these different things. It's like science, man. It's really, really cool. So I think that's a great name for the record.
And I think a lot of creativity is kind of just on its very base level is just saying, you know what, I'm just going to experiment. I'm just going to see what happens. I'm going to see how this makes me feel. I'm going to see how it makes other people feel.
So when you first started writing, like you said, about a year and a half ago, how did that start feeling writing these songs? Because you'd been doing Jelly Rock's records and you had been doing the Revelry. And so like what was it like writing in that, 11-7, very, very specific branded style?
Well, so I had just done an EP for Davy's band, The Revelry, which is very sort of guitar heavy. And then obviously all of the Jelly Rock stuff, I lean really hard onto analog synthesizers. So I'd try not to use software as much as possible. Like there's a few things on the Jelly Rock stuff that are software synthesizers, but for the most part, it's kind of wrangling this super old antiquated machinery that doesn't always work really well and glitches out. And it's just kind of like, it's not the easiest thing to work with. And you never know when you fire it up what's going to happen or if all the notes are going to sound or they're all going to play at the right times. Well, tons of that stuff. Like, yeah. Because I also live next to the Moog factory. So it's yeah.
Are you happy I knew how to pronounce it? Yeah, you happy I knew how to pronounce it?
Yeah, I am. That's pretty impressive. Yeah.
But you get that at the Moog.
That is like, I think that's such a specific sound for you, that the depth of it, the way that you love it, it's not something that you can get from another.
Yeah, that's also something that I love Jelly Rock's music. Especially the last full length you put out, Bang and Whimper.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I just felt like there was a lot of magic there. A couple of those songs, I was like, damn, I wish those were 11-7 songs. So when we got back together, we sort of discussed it and we thought about what should a new 11-7 record sound like, and we knew it should have some element of pop punk, but then it was also. Well, Matt's been on this trajectory in his own growth as an artist in analog synthesizers and building those textures. It's foolish not to bring that back in because that was where 11-7 was heading. It was sort of a pop punk thing that had a lot of electronic elements. So there's a lot of that on the new record.
And for me, listening to this record, I said to you the other day, Matt, and I've probably said it with every song that I've heard, these are the best songs I've ever heard you write. And I think that no, seriously, they are very, very solid. They are catchy. There's so much depth to them. And not that the other songs weren't, but you did have Milk and Lightning, but we're just going to but the depth of them, but I think that came from the work that you were doing with the Jelly Rocks, experimenting and growing as a writer and as an artist and kind of finding that groove that carries over into this record is pretty awesome from a fan standpoint, but also as a friend standpoint. I love it. It's not like I heard these things and I had to be like, they're all right, bud. But I think you really need to work on the.
I think we've all been in that situation before. So I was going to say like melding the stuff that I was kind of learning as we were going along with Revelry and then kind of tying in all the electronic stuff. I ultimately ended up like coming off of Bang and Whimper and then headed into producing for the Fast Feeling, this band that I'm in with some of the 5 Iron dudes and Leonore. And so that was a pretty extensive process of like doing a ton of different remote, like locale recording, flying out to Denver and recording with Scott. Like we did all of our drums in Scott's basement. He built a studio literally so we could work on the album remotely, like with each other.
And that's on the Fast Feelings record?
Yeah, this is the Fast Feeling. And I think when it's almost like, I don't want to say that it was like a practice ground, but everything that you do is practice for whatever the next thing is. So I think I learned some things that I knew didn't work from that record, and I had like.
So what are some of those things?
I think it's always been a challenge to kind of meld guitars and synthesizers together, because when you have a guitar in your hands, there's something that feels right about, like, the part you write with a guitar in your hands is not the same part that you write with your fingers on keys.
Right.
It just hits a totally different part of your brain. I don't know, Matt, I don't know if you've ever experienced this before or how involved you've been in like the writing with all the new wave release stuff, but I have to imagine it's probably
a lot of our
similar.
stuff starts out on piano.
Yeah.
And then gets converted into guitar stuff.
Yeah.
So and we have to mess around with it because, like you said, you'll play it, like Dave will play something a certain way on the piano, and then, to translate it to guitar, you have to change things sometimes.
So that's a really interesting point, because when I'm writing songs, they always start on an acoustic guitar, just me and an acoustic guitar, and then I will write my melodies and my hook, and I will get sort of the basic structure of the song and make sure it just works with that. And then I take it to a band, or I'll demo it and track other instruments over top of it. I'm curious about some of these songs on this record. I know you have a sort of a different workflow than I do, and maybe even that Waverly has, where it seems like sometimes you're starting in the box and you're starting building things.
Yeah, like sometimes I start off with loops, or I actually find that like the thing that helps me be creative the most is kind of walking around doing manual labor. If there's like a yard to cut, or there's trees to trim, or there's something to do around the house, or it's like, oh, I can vacuum, or I can sweep,
knit,
or
I can knit something. To love your creative process.
I promise she doesn't think I'm creative enough in that area. So, but I was like, I don't know, when I get my mind off of trying to write something and just kind of let my subconscious float stuff up to the top, then I'll kind of get something like maybe a half-baked idea for a melody. Then I'll sit down, try that out over several drum loops. Like, okay, well, what? And all the whole time that I'm doing this, I'm literally just waiting until I feel something. Like, I think I might have a cool melody on my hands, but I'm like, what's going to embellish that melody? Is it going to be like, will it be the right drum beat? Will it be the right time signature underneath it? What happens if I turn like a 4/4 song to 6/4? Or like, what happens if I kind of make it have more of a triplet-y vibe? And I just kind of go from there. And it's actually a little bit maddening, because you just kind of have, when you kind of start building loops, which most of the time I'll start off building a loop for the chorus. So like just sitting there listening to 4 or 8 bars over and over and over again.
You do that first before you have a melody in your head of what you would want to sing?
Or sometimes I'll have a melody in my head and I'll just kind of program, because you can sing any melody over bump, 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 bump. And then you just kind of start moving kick drums around, moving snare drums around, like seeing what makes the melody the most interesting, and just kind of building it from there.
So that's really interesting. And I wonder if there's a connection between your workflow and how married you are to certain parts of the song, and my workflow and how married I am to certain parts of my song. So like for me, when we're tracking together and we're tracking on some songs that I've written for other projects, typically it's, I don't put a lot of stock into anything but the actual song itself.
Right.
As long as we're not changing the song.
I mean, from like a bird's eye view.
Yeah. So if it's like, is there too much mid-range in this synth tone, or does this need more, more lead guitar parts or anything like that? And that's just not an incredibly important thing to my workflow.
Right.
But is it an important thing to your workflow? Because I know that often I will say something like, hey, maybe we should think about this. And it's like a very real conversation and discussion that has to happen to ever come to a point where...
Yeah, because everybody's listening to different things. They're listening for different stuff. I think when I'm listening to a song, I'm mostly just trying to not get bored. As soon as I get bored or I feel like there's not enough variance, then I'm like, okay, we need to tweak. We need to move something around. Either we need to introduce a new part, or we need to change up the beat just a little bit here. Even just like something as simple as like, let's push the kick on this one measure and just kind of see what that does to the vocal melody, if it kind of makes it feel a little more intentional. Like just little things like that. So I kind of envy your songwriting process, because when I've seen you kind of go through this, it really is just you and acoustic guitar just kind of like doodling until you find something and you kind of hear it in your head. And for me, it's like I'll get that, but I can't stop myself from traveling down all these other rabbit trails of like, what does the kick sample need to be? Does it need to be big and long and tonal, or does it need to be short and like more rhythmic?
I'm totally willing to just pass it off to a band. Like I really am. I'm willing to pass it off to other musicians and say, what do you think is best? Go ahead and do that. But that's not really the way you do things. And that's great, because Eleventyseven wouldn't sound like Eleventyseven if, and this record wouldn't sound like this record if that wasn't the way you did things. So
now with this, I mean, because you've continued to write since Eleventyseven's, unfortunate death. But you continue to write. What were some inspirational things like in your life that you were pulling from on this record? Because, sometimes when we're in different places in life where different situations are happening, you're able to pull from a different, from different things. Now you haven't been on the road touring, but you've continued to produce, you've continued to write music. So where was your headspace in the beginning stages of this?
I think, Davey, you and I have talked about this a lot, actually. And it might have even been at that beach conversation that we had where you were like, Bad Kitty might not be a great album name.
To myself.
Thank you, Davey.
Right. When I was like thinking about all this stuff, I was thinking like, if I were a fan of a band, like if I step back from Eleventy, because we had a few years like to kind of step back and experience Eleventy not being members of it, like looking at it from the outside, I feel like it gave us a little bit of a perspective. I was like, well, if I were to go to see an Eleventy show, or I were to be super into Eleventy and their music, what are the things that I really enjoy about their band as a listener? And what are the things that would excite me if I had just bought a ticket to their reunion show and I knew that they had new music coming out, and I'm sitting there and I'm waiting and the lights go down. Yeah. It's completely, I was like, we need to get into the user experience. Like,
and so that was
that's how you
something,
value fans,
exactly.
is getting in their head.
So my life since really being in Eleventyseven has been in software, so like a big part of software is user experience and user testing and understanding user flows and like getting in the mind of a user of a certain system.
Yeah.
That can be applied everywhere, and it can especially be applied in a creative process. So when in this conversation actually covered the entire universe of Eleventyseven, right? That's why this podcast exists, because we thought to ourselves, what do we like to consume from people or from the creatives we look up to, right? So. Right. The Pete Holmes podcast was like
you made it weird.
Yeah, like love it so much, and all of this different media that we consumed daily that we knew meant something to us and added value to us. We wanted to put together sort of a universe of Eleventyseven to give to fans that they could then ingest and provide some value.
Like it would be all the best parts of Eleventyseven.
But then a side product of that has been, because maybe that was the intention in mind, but there has been a lot of information that I've learned and that we've shared together that has been encouraging to us, and I know from feedback from other people has been encouraging to them as well. And so when you listen to this, it went from like, we could just talk about the highlights of Eleventyseven, but you've brought in other bands like Waverly, as well as the Rough and Tumble, and talking about different aspects of the industry. So it's really turned into something else. And you talked about going into this record thinking of the fan experience.
Right.
And I hear that in some of the songs, but I also hear you're making statements on this record about like social statements. You're making statements about our culture and things like that actually really hit home, that are really powerful. And I have to imagine that maybe going in with that intention, but then writing these songs that I've never heard Eleventy even go there. It's kind of, as a fan of consuming this, it was like, yes, this is the sound that I want to hear, but the message is not just like ear tickling to fans. It's actually like, it's got substance to it.
So think about like going to see your favorite movie, like the movies that you want to quote always. Like maybe it's a comedy, maybe it really makes you laugh, but the story underneath all the jokes is it's resonant with the human condition in some way. Like you're tapping into something that's incredibly important and universal that like everybody's kind of sharing, and it's a shared experience. I kind of was looking at the record in that way as well. Like we're not going to be the band that just like all of a sudden writes a lyric that somehow just changes the course of American politics. Like we're not trying to be that band. But what we are trying to say is like, we're also people. Sometimes we're just trying to tell fart jokes or just like make fun of something, just like you would in a regular conversation. But there are other times where it's like, oh, I have your attention. Let's talk about something important. Like, so I feel like it's Eleventy's always sort of walked that line of like sort of having songs like Evil Genius and at the same time being really drawn to writing songs like Give It Up that like feel a little more like wrestling with the human condition and just being alive and like and trying to meld these ideas of like humanity and the role of religion in people's lives and like what that actually looks like in people's lives and how complicated everything is to just wake up and be or to allow yourself to be.
I know how I felt listening to this record for the first time. I'd love to hear, Matt, how you've heard some of the tracks, so I don't know if you've heard the whole record.
I have.
What was your thought as an outsider?
That was the bit.
I have.
Yeah, what's your thought?
Well, I told Matt this earlier. I've always been more drawn to the pop punk side of Eleventyseven just because I was a pop punk kid. So I was happy starting the record off that it was kind of a throwback. Not like steeped in nostalgia or something like that. But I was just really happy about
It's
that.
powerful too. Yeah.
I was really
right
stoked that it wasn't just a full on, because I know that you've been focused on the Jelly Rocks. And so that was my only, like, I wonder if it's just going to be, this is basically a Jelly Rocks record, but we're calling it Eleventyseven. But
Right.
it wasn't like that. So I was happy about that. That's just me.
He was happy it sounded nothing like Jelly Roll.
Won't we all?
Well, at that point, I mean, you're doing, that'd be
Sure, that's
Just-
Well,
put out
that's
another
not
Jelly
super
Rocks
surprising because last time you and I were talking together over a beer in Nashville, I
Yeah.
think you were like, "Yeah, so some coworkers of mine are really into the Jelly Rocks," and I was like, "Oh, cool, yeah. What did you think of it?" And you were like, "Yeah, the coworkers think it's great. All my friends at work think it's really
Yeah.
cool."
a guy that worked with me at Star 88 loved Jelly Rocks. Loved it. Started plugging it in. He's like, "Have you ever heard this band?" I was like, "That's Matt from Eleventyseven." And he was like, "What?
Yeah.
What?" And he was
Delete.
he was the flip of me. He was like, 11-7? What?
That MySpace band?
Yeah. But I attach so much with music that I like. Same with movies. It's all about like the moment that I heard it a
Yeah.
lot of times. And so 11-7's always been just important to me because we came up in the label together, so it's like a completely different. So that was another thing that tied into it. I was happy that some of that was back because it just brought back memories.
Right.
But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think the lyrics are really clever.
Do you ever have these moments where you were on tour with bands and you know that if you had just seen a press photo of them, you would have been like, "Oh, hell no.
Yep.
I'm never listening to this band.
Oh,
This
yeah.
pretentious bunch
Yeah,
of
yeah.
douchebags."
Well, if you'd have seen the first Waverly press photos, which
I did.
the ones by the airplane, which were
I
just
had
miserable.
met you before I saw those airplane photos.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like when you tour with a band and you get to know them, you're like, "Oh, I get it. That's not really them.
This
That's a
isn't
press
that.
photo. That's like
Yeah,
they're
that's
not the press
something
photo. Somebody was in their ear about that. Like,
Yeah, Troy.
yeah.
It was all his idea.
Former president of Flickr Records.
Right. So I totally get that.
And what's funny is sometimes with those photos, if you haven't heard the band before, you aren't sure even what their style is. Then you're judging the name like,
Yeah.
is this a pop punk band? Is this a
Yeah.
butt rock band or whatever you want to call it?
I think that's part of the reason we haven't done promo photos for New Waverly stuff. Like we haven't done any. We've thrown around. It's like, oh, we need to all get together and take a new picture, but none of us
Matt and I have been
Yeah.
batting that back and
None of
forth
us
for
have
about
been
a year
hard.
now.
The one idea that we all liked was Teddy. At one point, he said we need to just get the 6 of us together, like everybody, and do a silhouette. And it's like, yes, that's a good idea. So nobody can really see us. Well, but then when we play live, like Seth isn't playing live, and
Right.
Teddy can't play live because
Right.
he's so busy. So it's Kuhn and myself and Dave and Jamie. And then Nuke from House of Heroes plays guitar with us.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't, a press photo would be like, well, who's this guy?
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's no point to it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
makes sense.
that's kind of a weird thing for Davey and I right now too. But I think the thing that makes it, we've always been historically kind of bad at like photos. Like it was always, we actually
Yeah.
were really happy when the label came along and they were like, hey, you guys should try all this stuff out. And so that's how we ended up with some of those early press photos that we
They're pretty
that
awesome
we did
on the scooter.
Yeah, but they also hired this guy named Dave Hill, who's just amazing photographer. Like he can just pull
Yeah, we
these
worked with Dave
crazy
Hill, too.
images out of
That's
the
who
universe.
took those airplane photos of us.
Yeah, he's fantastic, and he was really cool to work with. And he didn't have any shortage of ideas. And once he kind of gave us something to go with, then we could obviously sit there and be pouty lipped for like 5 minutes. But yeah,
I know how hard it is to take a selfie with you without you making goofy faces. So I can't
well,
imagine.
I know because it's
so
like
hard.
Well,
and think about this. Like, if I don't know how like well Matt's personality comes across through this podcast, or just how well the fan base understands Matt's personality. But Matt's personality is if you are even.
We're looking at a photo right now. It's very difficult. You couldn't post that to social media because it's been a while, man.
Of Matt I took today.
Yep.
If like to me, like if I feel myself starting to take myself too seriously around Matt, he calls me out and he embarrasses me for taking myself too seriously. So like that is the whole thing. So I think maybe to a fault, but we get to a point where we're taking pictures and it's like both of us are just like, what do we do? Look
I know,
ridiculous.
yeah, exactly. So we become paralyzed. So the default that we go to is like, well, let's just be ridiculous, because the moment, like literally, I feel like I have the sensitivity to the moment that someone's taking a picture and the whole goal of it is for me to look cool and somehow
Yeah.
entice you to listen to my music. I am miserable.
Right.
I do not care about that.
Yeah,
I could care
same.
less.
It's so
I'd rather
hard.
just not have my picture
Like
on
that's
anything.
the hardest part about this whole process so far has been like
How do we take pictures?
images, like
Got a great idea.
images, video, all
You guys
this
should
stuff.
be silhouettes. I just thought of that.
That's
a
a pretty
good
cool
idea.
idea.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, thought about it.
Like
That's
getting on
quite
the
novel.
getting on the
For me.
podcast and talking is one thing, because you're able to explain yourself. You know, in writing the record, you're able to in audio form, like form your opinion and your
And
your argument.
reform your thoughts until there's something that you're comfortable with.
Right.
Like,
we
but
just don't really like the way we look.
I guarantee it.
I guarantee
Right.
it. Man, I'm so glad you didn't forget how to write a pop punk song. I was worried about it. I'll be honest. I was listening to Jelly Rocks and kind of like the way that this was going. I was like,
You were worried I didn't know how to write a punk
Well,
song?
my thing was I've just never been a big electronic music guy.
Yeah.
You know, so that was I was just never drawn to it.
Well, we always had like this big group of fans that, like, for whatever reason, were always like, man, make more music sounds like Fake Believe. And I was like, and that's not, I'm not making fun of them. That's what they sound like.
that's how they
Fake
talk.
Believe.
All of them.
Yeah.
Nostalgia-topia.
But I knew that there were people that were drawn to our band because all of the comparisons that we got was like, oh, you like Eleventyseven, you'll like Blink-182. It's like, no, just skip us and go ahead to Blink. Like this, you're going to be a lot happier with the results.
Yeah.
But that was the music that we grew up on.
Yeah.
And it was like, I think
absolutely.
people were attracted to those sensibilities in us because we loved playing those and performing those and like being a part of that. So there are some very distinctively pop punk moments on the record.
Yeah, definitely moments. I wouldn't say because you've incorporated synth and different breakdowns and things like that have made it, fresh and unique to what you're doing now. But guys like me who love that kind of stuff too, still are just they're going to be very stoked about this record.
We've also like historically struggled with an identity crisis where it's
Yeah,
like
totally.
as soon as Galactic came out, it was like I was just kind of concerned with synthesizers. Like, how do I make this? Like, I just got so into programming and it was so satisfying for me and so fun that it was a rabbit hole.
Who'd you work with? Ian Esklin?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did that record with Ian.
I remember asking you while you guys were recording, I was like, well, how do you feel about it? And you saying,
It's complicated.
It's either going to be the best thing we've ever done or the worst thing we've
Yep.
ever done by far.
Yep.
And I
Yeah.
was like, well, he doesn't feel good about it.
It's hard. In that process, you're not sure. There's a lot
Yeah,
of
but I
question
think
marks.
that's great though, because if you leave the last day of recording and you're thinking to yourself, it's
Nailed
okay.
it.
It's okay, then
Yeah.
you're in dangerous water. Like, you really need to
Then maybe
do
it wasn't a
Maybe
good
phoned
fit.
it in.
to do to do anything of impact, which I'm not saying we have, but to do anything of impact, it's like you got to be riding that. Some people might hate it, some people are gonna love it, kind of thing.
So the interesting thing about what we've done in 11D is that the things that I've produced even though they may not have been historically, like may not have been like the best sounding 11D things that we've done, they've been the most fulfilling. And stepping into that role as producer is something that I knew that I wanted to do, I think, from day one. And maybe we'll get into that on the next podcast.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Is it time?
Because I'm actually interested to hear what your experience has been like with other producers that you've worked with.
Oh, yeah.
Because it always seems like there's going to be some fun stories. Thank you so much for joining with us this week on 11D Life. Thank you so much for engaging in the show, letting us know what you think about it. And we can't wait to see you next week.